Ryan Humphries, and welcome to the CU CateCast, which looks like it's going to actually work today, which is great news. This is the Book of Nehemiah, which we have said now for the last several times that we've met, is connected to the first and second book of Chronicles and the book of Ezra, all of which we believe were written by the same guy, a priest/scribe, of the name Ezra. And so if you go back to the old Latin Vulgate, which was put together originally, you have the book of Esdras, which is just the way of saying Ezra. Now, one of the things that I've not mentioned before, and I want to mention before we leave these books, is that modern Judaism, the Judaism that Jesus lived, was basically created by Ezra and Nehemiah. This is something that I didn't do because it occurred to me I was focusing on the book very closely. But Ezra and Nehemiah, when they came back from the Babylonian exile, they were in a position to say, gosh, the temple had been destroyed. Everything had been destroyed that Judaism was. And so they collected the books of the Bible, that the Old Testament they could get. They put those together. They kind of compiled and arranged. And so the emphasis placed upon, say, following the rule of Moses. Everything we know about Sadducees, Pharisees, the scribes, none of whom Jesus has a big smile for. We know that they're not the most popular for him. But that whole structure of like these religious groups, that came from Ezra and Nehemiah. And it actually worked fairly well in terms of getting the people, the Jewish people, to recover a sense of their own identity. It did not work well in all ways, and of course Jesus points out specifically where it fails, but the whole notion of modern Judaism that Jesus experienced flows from Ezra and Nehemiah, which is one of the reasons that they're so important. And it's easy if you're just reading the scriptures themselves to go, who cares about these people? So the guy stood up and read from the law all day, or this guy was in charge of rebuilding some walls. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is a lot more than just what we see in the books that are named after them. You may also recall, now that we get specific to the book of Nehemiah, that the original Catholic structure of the Bible, of course, had all these as four, and so this is the fourth of a series of books that were designed to kind of set the stage for Judaism. The events take place in about the 400s BC, and the texts were already appearing in translation less than 100 years after that. So we're pretty sure of the time that this stuff played out. And so we want to look today at Nehemiah, who was sort of kind of a king and sort of kind of a governor and sort of kind of a lot of different things. He was an administrator. That was what he was good at. He got some of his cred because he was in the court of the king of a place called Susa, which was part of the Babylonian/Persian Empire. But he was an administrator. He was not ever a priest of any sort. And even though sometimes we call him in the Bible His Excellency, we don't really have the sense that he had a royal kingdom or a royal association. He was an administrator who kind of worked with Ezra, who was of the priestly tribe of Levi, to put all the pieces together. And so our story today begins with Nehemiah being told, because he's gossiping or listening to gossip in the king's court, Jerusalem doesn't have its city walls. The city walls have been knocked down in Jerusalem, and Nehemiah throws a hissy fit. He freaks out, has a panic attack, all that kind of stuff, and he says, gosh, the walls of Jerusalem are destroyed. I've got to do something about it. Somebody has got to get over there and get on it. So Nehemiah prays to God. He recalls the sins of Israel in the Bible, and then he recalls God's promises and says, you know what? I'm going to ask the Lord if he will let me go over and restore the city walls to Jerusalem. And the king of Persia is receptive and, in fact, cuts him a check and says, go get it done. Now, it's worth remembering that city walls are symbolic as much as they are realistic. At this time, people who are attacking a city are doing so with spears, rocks, and swords. And so all it takes is a big old wall 10 feet high, and you can't get through. That's it. No problem. And so the walls are symbolic. The higher they are, the more symbolic that it's inconquerable. And because Jerusalem is meant to be the heart of the Jewish faith, that city needs these big city walls to show to the Jews themselves and to other people that God himself is unconquerable. And you'll remember in Ezra last week, and in fact a couple weeks ago when we got back to the books of Samuel, that there were great defeats. And in fact in the first book of Chronicles, the Ark of the Covenant itself was captured and taken away. And for the symbolic way of thinking, that for the people meant that God had been destroyed. And so in the symbolic mind, Nehemiah pointing out that the city walls have been destroyed is devastating, and he needs to rebuild the city walls to show people that God is not dead, but that God is powerful. And so Nehemiah has the big check from the king. He goes to Jerusalem. He's got the money he needs. He looks at the city walls and he says, everything here stinks. You people are all doing it all wrong, and I need to tell you how to do things better. I could make a joke about modern day politicians, but I won't do that because it's just too easy. But Nehemiah looks at everything over. He chews out the high priest Elishib, and he begins rebuilding Jerusalem. Now, as this happens, the enemies of the city, specifically those people who want to see Jerusalem weak, they show up and start to kind of hassle the workmen. And so you have this bizarre image of the people building the city walls with a hammer in one hand and a sword in the other. The idea that they're working armed because the danger is so imminent. Again, this is a potent image for Jewish people of what it means to be a Jew. We're constantly being attacked and assailed by the enemy, and so we have to be ready not just to defend our city, but to be on the attack at any moment. And really and truly, even more than the actual process of wearing a sword while you're building a wall, this image is a very, very Jewish image. It goes way backward to the time that the Jews were being attacked and enslaved in Egypt, and it goes all the way forward to right now, where the Jews are surrounded by viciously hostile nations who are trying to destroy them at every turn. You know, the poor Jews never seem to get ahead in the universe. And so Nehemiah simply is pointing that out. So as they're working, they've got their weapons in their hands, Nehemiah sees that not only are there outside enemies, but they're inside enemies as well. And in fact, the rich Jews are oppressing the poor Jews. And so he says, basically, this has got to stop. We can't destroy each other from the inside because we have this from the outside. And so Nehemiah says, all debts are now canceled. All the rich Jews need to stop being rich and just get on board with everybody else. A guy named Sanballat shows up and accuses Nehemiah of basically... He accuses Nehemiah in order to get him out of the good graces of this king back over there in Persia who is funding this whole operation. And so this guy shows up and says, oh, Nehemiah is doing all this bad stuff, but the king over in Susa, who I'm not saying his name because it's really hard to say. It's Artaxerxes. It's just a hard name. But this king over there is like, I'm not buying it. I don't agree. I don't believe what you're saying. And now the walls are completed. And so Nehemiah, the great administrator, appoints officials. He sets guards, he sets up the walls and the gates, and now he says we need to make a census and figure out where the city stands. And of course, the king in Susa is delighted because he's paid some money, he's got the product he wanted, things are going well, Nehemiah's got his act together. This is where we have that scene that we had in the readings at Mass a few weeks ago, where Nehemiah gets everybody together. Ezra stands up on top of the tall dais and all day long reads the book of the law. What a delight. That must have been a hoot of a day. So he reads the book of the law the entirety of the day as all the people who live in the desert are standing in the desert listening to somebody chant, scream, read a book of law all day long. I'm sure it must have been absolutely like reading the tax code. But at any rate, the people listen to Ezra read the book all day, And then Nehemiah, Ezra, and the remaining priests of the temple say, okay, it's time to kind of get a religious festival going, and they reinstitute the Feast of Booths in accordance with the law. That should sound familiar because that's what's referenced in the transfiguration of Jesus when Peter and Paul, or Peter's up there and Jesus is there next to Moses and Elijah, and Peter says, let us erect 3 booths, 3 tents really, where we can have these little shrine sort of things set up. And so the Feast of Booths is one of many feasts. We won't get off into that for the moment, but they have reestablished the first religious feast now. The city walls are up, and then they're going to get going on rebuilding the temple. The Jews all get together to celebrate the feast in penance and in prayer. They recall their past sins. They recall God's goodness. They recall his promises. And then the priests, the Levites, and the people enter into kind of a renewal of the covenant. They agree to separate themselves from the surrounding people, and they agree to basically anybody who has taken a pagan wife or pagan, kind of pagan spouse has to break up with them, or they have to leave the city. Anybody who has done anything that is unforgivable has got to go, and the Jews have to reestablish their sense of identity. And so then Jerusalem becomes repopulated with the Jews in that city, and then they spread out and begin to repopulate the towns that have been theirs traditionally in the promised land. From that, we have especially the tribes of Judah and Benjamin who get referenced in the verses in the Bible or in the book of Nehemiah. And then we get this long list of priests and Levites who return to the city. And this basically is going to function kind of like as if your name is here, you've got bona fides for the future of Judaism. And then after 12 or so years, Nehemiah is done. He's done his bit. So he goes back to Susa to check in with the king. Later on, he is sent back to check in again. And so we have kind of a bit of a time jump, and he finds that people have been backsliding. People have not been doing the things he told them to do. So he takes measures to kind of reinforce the previous reforms that he has set in place, and he asks for God's favor, and we get done with chapter 12, and the book ends. It's not a long book. It's not even a hard book, and it's not a book that requires a great deal of commentary because it really is pretty straightforward. The overarching, like a hammer message, is you have to obey the law of God. And the moment you don't obey the law of God, even a little bit, God will destroy you with a hammer. And then if you do that, you need to get destroyed by a hammer by obeying the law of God. And that's it. And so you have Ezra and Nehemiah in conjunction with the books of Chronicles that basically put together the idea that the Jews had been sent to the exile because they were disobedient to the law of God. The temple was destroyed because they were disobedient to the law of God. And then Ezra and Nehemiah hammer home that if you do what God says, God wants to be your king himself. He never wanted to make David the king. He wants to be your king, and if you obey him, he will protect you and give you good stuff. And if you don't obey him, he will squash you with a hammer. So that is the kind of the last great message of the 4 books of Ezra. Now, just to give you a very, very brief sense of what's going forward, for the Protestants, we're done with history. There is no more history to be had. We're just going to jump straight ahead to the books of wisdom. But in the Catholic Bible, we have the book of Tobit, the book of Judith, the book of Esther, and the books of Maccabees left to go that are going to fill in the history, although it's not always history the way that we think of history. This is more like history the way that Robin Hood tells about Middle Ages England, right? It's not a history in the sense of these things happened as much as it paints a picture of the ethos and way of being. So we're going to have some interesting history to come up. Tobit will come next. That will be next week. As I'm giving this, that should be the first Wednesday in February, and I think that's it. And so there's not much else to say about the books of Esdras, but we will next week pick up the wonderful story of the book of Tobit, I believe, is next week. and it is, and hope to see you there. I've been Father Ryan Humphries. This has been the CU CateCast. Have a great day.